In our Intro to Physiology lecture, we talked briefly about nervous tissue and cells. Now we're going to look at the nervous system more broadly and how it helps us regulate our bodies and respond to the environment. First, let's review the anatomy of a neuron. You may remember that a neuron has three main parts: the cell body, which contains the nucleus and other organelles, the dendrites, which receive signals, and the axon, which transmits. Again, remember axon away. These neurons are bundled together with connective tissue to form nerves. Let's review some of this terminology with some questions from participation assignment 16. When we lose neurons, they don't grow back. The average human loses about 9,000 neurons every day. This is part of the normal aging process. But some things can cause you to lose a larger number of neurons. Things like drinking a lot of alcohol or being exposed to toxins can cause an additional loss of neurons. There are three different types of neurons in the nervous system: sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. Sensory neurons do just what their names suggest. They sense. They collect information from the animal's external environment. The dendrites of sensory neurons, which again is part of the neuron that receives a signal, are modified to respond to the external stimulation rather than to receive signals from other neurons. So when you touch something with your hands, the dendrites of sensory neurons respond to that touch. Interneurons are the go-between and the interpreters of these electrical signals. They're located in the brain and the spinal cord. They receive signals from sensory neurons, interpret them, and relay those signals to the motor neurons so you can respond to the stimulus. So back to feeling a sensation with your hands. The dendrites of the motor neurons pick up the sensation and send an electrical signal through those nerves to the interneurons, taking the message to the brain to be interpreted. After it is interpreted and the brain decides how to respond, the signal is sent to the motor neurons, which initiate a response to the stimulus. They do this by sending signals to muscles or glands. If the signal is sent to a muscle, it may cause that muscle to contract. Or it may send a signal to a gland, causing it to start releasing a hormone. In humans and other vertebrates, these neurons are organized into two systems: a peripheral nervous system and a central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system includes the sensory and motor neurons. The sensory neurons receive signals from the environment and send that information to the central nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the interneurons in the brain and spinal cord. Again, these are interpreting those signals from the sensory neurons and deciding how to respond. The central nervous system then sends signals back to the peripheral system, this time to the motor neurons, which trigger the response. Now pause and answer these questions about different types of neurons. So how do neurons actually transmit these electrical signals? And what actually is an electrical signal? It all has to do with the movement of charged particles into, through, and out of the neurons. You may have noticed how important concentration gradients are in biology. This is just another example of how concentration gradients are integral to the functioning of our cells. Here is an outline of the process, but we're going to go through it step by step. Again, the information transmitted by the nervous system is all electrical signals. When a neuron fires, it transmits an electrical signal either to another neuron or to a muscle or gland. Whether a neuron is firing or at rest depends on the electrical charge inside the cell compared to the charge outside the cell. This difference in charge inside and outside the cell is known as a membrane potential. Again, that electrical signal, that charge, is created by concentration gradients of charged particles. There are two different types of membrane potentials we can see in a neuron, depending whether it is at rest or firing. When neurons are at rest, the membrane potential is known as a resting potential. At rest, the charge inside the neuron is more negative than the outside the neuron. When a neuron is ready to fire, the membrane potential is an action potential. This means the charge is now more positive inside the cell than outside the cell. So how does the charge inside the cell change? It all has to do with the movement of charged ions into and out of the cell. To generate a resting potential, the neuron pumps positively charged ions outside of the cell through ion channels in the cell membrane. Notice I said pump. This means we're talking about active transport. The cell needs to use some energy to pump those positive ions out of the cell. As those positively charged ions leave the cell, the charge inside the cell becomes more negative than outside the cell. Now the neuron has a resting potential and is ready to respond when it receives a signal. When the dendrites pick up a stimulus, those ion channels that we use to pump ions across the membrane open. Remember that particles tend to move against their concentration gradient, so those densely packed positive ions outside the cell start to rush back into the neuron through the open ion channels. Now we have a more positive charge inside the cell. Once the positive charge inside the neuron is great enough, it initiates the action potential. This positive charge, which again we can also think of as an electrical signal, travels down the axon of the neuron. Now answer these questions about membrane potentials. So that action potential travels down the axon to the axon terminals, the ends of those branches on the axon. But it still needs to be passed to the next neuron, or the tissue it's going to affect. Neurons are not in direct contact with each other. There is a space between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of the next, called the synapse. When the action potential reaches the axon terminals, it triggers the release of chemicals called neurotransmitters into the synapse. Those neurotransmitters bind to receptors on the dendrites of nearby neurons. The binding of those neurotransmitters signals a response in the neuron. It may cause that neuron to start generating an action potential, which can then travel down the axon, release neurotransmitters, and send the signal to the next neuron. Or those neurotransmitters might cause some other response, such as binding to receptors in muscle tissue, causing the muscle to contract, or to a gland, causing it to release a hormone. There are dozens of different neurotransmitters in the human body. Each one has different effects on the neurons or tissues and are interpreted differently by the brain. Now I'll finish up the lecture by answering these last two questions. Now let's talk about some examples of neurotransmitters and what they do. We just talked about what happens when a muscle is triggered to contract, but we didn't talk about what initiates that contraction. The skeletal muscles are innervated with motor neurons. When you decide to move your hand, your interneurons send signals to your motor neurons. When the signal reaches the axon terminals of the motor neurons innervating the muscle, the neurotransmitter acetylcholine is released. Acetylcholine causes a chain of chemical changes, opening ion channels. This is what triggers the myosin to detach from actin and change in shape, initiating muscle contraction. Another neurotransmitter, glutamate, is an important messenger and regulator of the nervous system. It is involved in learning and formation of memories, but can also affect our mood. Glutamate acts as a chemical messenger, binding to neurons and signaling them to fire. By doing this, it helps neurons communicate with one another. Having the right balance of glutamate is important for the function of the nervous system and our overall well-being. If we have too much glutamate, the nervous system can be overstimulated and even be damaged. This can lead to brain fog, anxiety, depression, and even seizures. But with too little glutamate, you may have trouble with memory and cognition, or even develop depression and anxiety. Another neurotransmitter that has many different functions is dopamine. You may have heard of dopamine, which is often referred to as the reward chemical, because it is released when we do something pleasurable, and reinforces that behavior by making us feel good. Dopamine affects our motivation and mood, but also helps us coordinate and initiate movement. Too little dopamine can cause depression and lack of motivation, and dopamine dysregulation is often seen in ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. You may also be familiar with a neurotransmitter called serotonin, because it plays a big role in regulation of mood. You may have heard of serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are a form of antidepressant. They prevent serotonin from being transported out of the synapses, maintaining a higher level of serotonin that can bind to and stimulate neurons. This is important because serotonin is important for balancing mood and generating feelings of contentment and calm.